Welcome back, AP. All right, let's get into it. Man, we are going to be cutting it close, but we're going to do what we got to do, right? So let's get into it, shall we? Now, anyway, so where do we need to get started? I don't even remember. Oh, yeah, where we left off in class, right? So, y'all, as you could tell, yesterday was a heavy review day, right? Big on the review. Because Louis is such a large figure, and French absolutism happens to be the biggest and most important image. Remember, Austria is like a JV-rate absolute player. They're not that big, but it is important to know that the Habsburgs are going to stay very large and powerful in Austria whilst they died in Spain, right? So that's why we look at those two things next to each other, right? So death of the Habsburg Spain, rise of the Austrian Habsburgs, right? So, and then we also discussed the last bits of Louis. We talked about the War of Spanish Succession, right? We talked about all that stuff. And we began to start Russia, right? So Russia is a very important thing to understand, okay? Russia, under the Ivans and under the Rurikid dynasty, is going to become a legitimate country, right? The Rurikids, R-U-R-I-K-I-D. Now, the big thing about it, though, is I have reformed this Prezi. I've made it better. It's going to be awesome. I'm super excited. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff that Carson will enjoy, a lot of, tongue ripping out and, a lot of stuff like that. It's going to be great, all right? So, great. Now, really quick, though, getting into it, big thing you need to understand is something that I'm going to drop in the description below, okay? So down in the description below, go ahead and smash that subscribe button. Now, so down in the description below, there's going to be a video of the progression of Russian landholding throughout their history, right? So what you're going to notice when you watch that video is that Russia started out as a very small territory under the control of the Mongolians, right? Under the control of the great Khans, right? Under the Khans and also the Tartars, right? So now under these people and under the control of the Mongolians, they were like a principality. They were something you would be more reminded of like a principality within the Holy Roman Empire. But I want you, and at the first, they were not even called Russia, right? They were called Muscovy, all right? So like Muscovy, which is going to eventually turn into the city of Moscow, right? So if you hear me say Moscow during this thing, I'm referencing this thing called Muscovy, all right? So you got to say it with a little bit of Russian salt in there. You got to be like Muscovy. And you'll hear me say some Russian words today. Get excited. Boris is coming out, all right? So now look, but big thing though, he started the growth. And what I say he, I mean Ivan III, right? Ivan III, Ivan Rurikid, is going to start the growth of what you would now consider Russia, right? Russia is going to start out as that small principality known as Muscovy, and it's going to begin to expand its territorial boundaries very slowly, right? And you'll notice that whenever you go look at this video down below. But under Ivan III, Russian princes are going to start consolidating their land and be like, you know what? We don't want to be ruled by the Mongols anymore. We don't want any of this nonsense, right? We won't want the Khans telling us what we're doing. And plus, by the way, everybody, the Khans are dying off in power. All right, so their power is being very depleted, right? It's slowly going down. The Khans, the Mongolians, had their height in the 1200s, the late 1200s, and in the hundreds of years that would follow, due to poor leadership, dissatisfaction with rule, rebellions across their entire empire, their power begins to deplete. And a big area where they start losing power is the area of Muscovy, right? So, and these Russian princes, these big landholders are going to decide, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to stop paying taxes to the Mongols, right? We're going to stop paying their taxes. We're going to stop using their systems, and we're going to stop paying tribute, and we're just going to give that money to Ivan instead. Because Ivan's like, I am going to consolidate all of you into a grand duchy of the Rurikids. I will just be your leader, right? And he was crowned, listen to this, the Grand Prince of Moscow. He was not necessarily a king, right? And a big group of people that he begins to enable and bring in are these people called boyars, right? Boyars. Now, boyars are Russian nobles, right? Every single area has a different name for their nobles. We've got road nobles and sword nobles in France. We've got lords and dukes and barons inside of England. We've got Junkers in Prussia, which is what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. And then you also have, who else do you have? Oh, yeah. You also have as well the boyars in Russia, right? So the boyars. Now, the Russian nobles are going to work with the Rurikid princes to copy Mongol practices, right? What I mean by that is somebody like, what are you talking about? They were just kicking him out. Yeah, well, the Russian princes and the large landholders begin to funnel money to Ivan. Ivan begins to use small militaries to push the Mongols out, right? And so underneath these Russian princes are these people called boyars, right? Russian nobles, okay? Because a prince is a ruler of a territory, a noble is a ruler of a land, right? Like a piece of land. A fief or a fiefdom is what a boyar rules over, right? And so the thing about it is they're going to work with the Russian princes like Ivan III, and they're going to copy the Mongols, right? They're going to use the things that made the Mongols so powerful, right? They're going to copy things like postal routes because the Mongols had the most efficient post office and postage system in the entire world. Post offices, they're so important. All right, so like now, they're also going to copy the Mongol practice of taking a census, and they're also going to copy the Mongol practice of basing their taxes off of everyone's income, right? So Ivan III, very important guy, right? And now the next guy we're talking about is another Ivan, and he looks like this. And some of y'all are like, oh, is this his son? No, this is his grandson, actually, right? So Ivan III gave birth, well, he didn't give birth, that'd be weird. Ivan III had a child that would rule after him known as Vasily, all right? So Vasily III, okay? So Vasily would actually be a very solid ruler. He would grow and expand some of the territories. He would conquer some of the areas in the north, call them the Novgorod, and like that's like the northern frontier of what would eventually be called Russia. But this guy, Vasily III's son, is going to be the one that really gets everything done. But he does so in some dicey ways, right? He is Ivan the Terrible, right? So Ivan IV, also known as Ivan Grozny, all right, so it's a Grozny, Grozny, Ivan Grozny, means literally Ivan the Terrible. Now, important thing to understand, though, was he really that terrible? We don't really know, okay? And a lot of this has to do with the fact that everyone loved Ivan III and Vasily III, right? They loved those guys because they were working with the nobles to grow and expand power. Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, though, does not want to work with the boyars, right? He wants to become the very first Russian Tsar and absolutist, right? So Russian absolutism truly starts with Ivan the Terrible, right? So now, was he that terrible? It's kind of hard to explain, right? Is he terrible to the poor? Not as much, because he created jobs for them. He created efficient systems of protection. He created a system of feudalism that somewhat benefited them. He gave them representation in the government. He created a better taxation system on the wealthy. So, like, the poor would not call him this. But then who calls him the terrible? It's the nobles that call him the terrible, right? The people that want the power. Now, some of you are like, oh, so was Ivan really nice? No. All right, so like we're going to talk about that as well. And I'm going to let you decide if Ivan Grozny has earned that title, right? But the big thing about it, though, is Ivan the Fourth, Ivan Grozny, is going to, and his full name, funnily enough, is Ivan Vasilyevich. All right, so Ivan Vasilyevich, because Vich in like ICH, the Vich part, means son of in Rome, or not in Rome, in Russian, right? So Ivan Vasilyevich is going to become Ivan IV, also known as Ivan Grozny, right? So, and he is going to ascend the throne at the age of 3. And I know right now Angelina's like, what's up with all these young little boys being kings and stuff? I mean, I agree with you, don't get me wrong. But what's going to end up happening is his mother, of course, is going to be like the queen regent, but there's also going to be a council of boyars that rules while he's a baby, right? So, and as he's growing, he's also, again, realizing that he doesn't much like nobles. So Ivan IV is kind of a lot like Louis XIV, right? They have similar personality characteristics, even though, ironically enough, Ivan IV was born several hundred years, or over 100 years before Louis XIV. That's right, Ivan IV, let's give some context, some dates, right? Because we know that Louis XIV's reign ended in 1714, but Ivan IV, Ivan Grozny, his reign is going to last from 1530 to 1584. That's how long he was alive. So to give you a heads up, Ivan the Terrible dies in 1584, almost 150 years before Louis would even, like, die, right? So, like, over 100 years before Louis or not over 100, but nearly 100 years before Louis was ever even born or would rule, right? So this is some primitive Russian stuff, all right? So, like, we're going harkening way back. Marie Rolliano was like, wait, why are we rewinding again? You have to do it. You got to do it. You got to understand that we have to pop over to a country, we got to rewind, and we got to go forward, right? Talk about absolutism's progression. Now, ironically enough, absolutism got a kickstart and got an early start over in Russia, right? Because, again, Ivan's going to ascend the throne at 3. His mother is going to be poisoned at the age of 8, right? So, or at least that's what he thought, okay? When he was 8 years old, he began to accuse the boyars of Russia of poisoning his mother, right? So he loses his mother and he becomes an orphan because obviously his father, Vasily, is already dead as well, right? So he becomes a parentless child at the age of 8, right? So maybe Ivan just had some emotional issues, all right? So, Also, though, it's age 16, he is like, I'm tired of this crap, and I don't want the boyars to rule anymore. I am Tsar now. And he crowns himself Tsar at the age of 16 in the most obnoxious ceremony you could imagine, right? So, like, he literally is sitting in his throne, and I feel like Morgan Hutchinson or Olivia Stanfield would definitely be like, that's how I want to be crowned. He was sitting in his throne and staring all of the boyars down while they said a prayer, and a person behind him lowered the crown onto his head, what could not be seen except for hands, right? And while it's coming down on him, gold coins are being showered all over him, and he's just like, what's up, right? So, like, it's a very intense ceremony, right? And so Ivan the Fourth is going to become a very, very intense figure. And then 2 weeks following his coronation as the first Tsar of Russia, T-S-A-R, or you spell it C-Z-A-R, which literally, where do you think the Russians get the word for Tsar? Caesar, right? So Caesar, it's actually a branch off of Julius Caesar. What does he do? 2 weeks later, he marries a Romanov princess. Anastasia Romanova, right, is his first wife of, count them, 7. All right, so like now he has 7 different wives, but this one is the one he truly believed he loved, right? Anastasia Romanova is going to be the entrance of the Romanov family into Russian politics, into major Russian politics anyway. So Anastasia, it is believed that they were devoutly in love with each other, right? That they were just obsessed with each other. They were so very in love, and they worked so hard to have as many children as they could. Most of them, unfortunately, are going to die in infancy, though. He has 9 children with Anastasia Romanova, and all but 2 of them die, right? So, like, all but 2 of them die in infancy or during the birthing process, right? So, some of y'all are like, man, Ivan's just really struggling. Ivan's got emotional issues. Well, before he even married her, and before he was even crowned, like, Tsar of Russia, at the age of 15, he did have this thing that I like to refer to as the tongue incident, when one of his closest courtiers, one of his closest assistants, and remember, do you understand where the word courtier comes from now, right? The court life of Louis XIV, the court of a king. A courtier is someone who is always there. They're a noble that's by your side that is like an advisor to the king, right? But one of his biggest courtiers, Ivan claimed that he used rude words in front of him when he was 15 years old. So he had a stage built in front of where the kings lived, in front of the Kremlin at the time, in Moscow. And he had a public ceremony held where they cut this man's tongue out and threw it to the crowd. But then Ivan felt really bad about it afterward. And he gave him a better job, and he made him his main courtier, but he couldn't talk because he had no tongue. Interesting, right? And this is before he meets the love of his life. Now, when this occurs, though, and when he becomes Tsar of Russia, he continues to push the Mongols back, creating the Russia that you know today. And again, if you jump down to that video down in the description, you'll see the expansion of territory under Ivan IV, right? He also creates absolutist institutions as the first Tsar of Russia, things that are necessary for an absolutist to reign, right? He creates the first Russian standing professional army, also known as the what are they called? The Strelitsky, right? So the Strelitsky is the very first Russian standing professional army. Spelled S-T-R-E-L-I, Strelitsky. All right, so yeah, L-I-T-S-K-Y, the Strelitsky. All right, now, anyway, so they're the first Russian professional army. They're going to be established in about 1546, right? So, and then he's also going to create the very first Russian feudal system, right? He's going to organize the feudal system into a system of boyars, and then also military fighters, the Strelitsky actually helping contain and protect the areas, and then the commoners at the very, very bottom, right? And then he's also going to create a Russian feudal parliament, right? So he actually creates a system and a legislative branch that actually works with him to rule over Russia effectively. Much like Cardinal Richelieu's intendant system, but a little bit better because it actually was meant to actually be more organized, better, and also it included a class of commoners on it, right? So the commoners, the serfs, were represented in the government. That's why a commoner might not refer to Ivan as Ivan the Terrible. And maybe the guy that got his tongue out deserved it. Who knows? You know what I mean? Like, maybe Ivan wasn't that bad. Maybe he's Ivan the Just, not Ivan Grozny. No, anyway, but really, really quick, though, that Russian parliament is called the Zimsky Sabor, right? The Zimsky Sabor. And, so in this Russian parliament, he's going to create a very effective system. And that was established, I think, in 1549. All right, but moving on, though, the death of Anastasia is going to change everything. So in 1560, Anastasia Romanova dies, right? He is left with only 2 children, and those 2 children are named Ivan V, or would be Ivan V. His name is Ivan Ivanovich, right? So he named him after himself, and he's like, that's my boy right there. That's my boy. It's his pride and joy. It was his best son. It was his favorite son. And then the other one was named Fedor. And I know right now, Salvaggio and Rowley and Grace and Morgan are all just like, because they know bits and pieces of the story already. Fedor spelled Feodor, all right? So Fedor is Fedor's a special bird, all right? So Fedor he's obsessed with religion. We believe he may have had some mental handicaps because he apparently would just sit in his room for days and pray. He couldn't carry on conversations with people. He couldn't rule. He was never going to be able to be an effective ruler. But Ivan was lucky because that's his second son, so it doesn't really matter, right? So, you know what, Fedor, just go over there and color and just don't bother anybody, right? And Fedor's like, okay. All right, so Fedor's just kind of a goofy dude, right? So Fedor, poor Fedor, he's just at the end of the table every night, eating chicken nuggets and coloring, right? Just hanging out. And some of you are like, I want to be Fedor. Like some of you are going to feel for Fedor probably. You're like, oh, poor Fedor. All right, so now look. But he's got 2 children left, right? And he goes on a campaign following this, right? Following the death of his wife, he goes on a campaign of marrying several other women, 7 of them actually. And a lot of these marriages don't end very well. He sends some of these wives to monasteries. He's like, I don't want to be married to you anymore. Go be a nun. And he just sends them away, right? He has 1 child with one of these wives, but again, that child only lives to see the age of about 3. Now, he starts a campaign, though, out of absolute paranoia. Some people believe the death of his wife caused a mental break inside of him, and then some elements of a bipolar disorder may have started to show themselves, right? So he starts a campaign of executing people that oppose him. He burned down, entire cities in the northern territories of Russia just because he thought the boyars might try something on him. He also, at one point, abdicated the throne. It was like, I'm done being Tsar in 1564, 4 years after the death of his wife. He was like, I don't want to be Tsar anymore, and he ran off. And the boyars were like, please come back, please come back. We can't rule this without a Tsar. We need somebody to be the central figure. And he's like, okay. And then he comes back, and he's like, but I'm the absolute leader now, right? And that's when he kind of becomes the absolute Tsar of Russia, when he returns following this. And when he comes back, he creates these things called let's move this guy. And I'll cover this one. He creates this thing called the Oprichniki and the Oprichniki. Right? So in the Oprichniki and the Oprichnina, after he returns from his abdication, is a secret police, and it's an assembly, a court made to put boyars on trial and have them executed, right? So he executed entire boyar families in Novgorod, which are the conquered northern territories above Moscow. And he used the Oprichniki and the Oprichnina to actually catch them and then have them executed in very malicious, very screwed up ways. This is one of the most famous, This is one of the most famous incidences of that. This guy right here, that's Ivan, right? And this dude right here, that's another dude. He's named Ivan Fyodorov, right? So, and this guy was a printer from Moscow, and he was printing negative things about Ivan. And Ivan freaked out, and the Oprichniki went and found this guy, and they forced him to dress in regal garb because Ivan was like, you trying to take my job, bro? You trying to take my job? And he called in the rest of the boyar families, and they all watched as Ivan apparently executed him and stabbed him to death, right? So, like, this is a very big thing. The Oprichniki is a very, very, very aggressive group, right? And so he executed these entire boyar families, and he would give the land that they would leave behind, because obviously a boyar family owns land. He would give it to these things called service nobles, right? Whose power depended on the king, which I think is friggin' genius, all right? So, like, it's absolutely genius, right? So these service nobles mirror the road nobles of France, right? And he's going to use the Oprichniki and the Oprichina to actually accomplish all of this. And then in other big, big deal things, he's also going to have, like, St. Basil's Cathedral built, right? This is something that Russians will be like, oh, that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. He's not that terrible. He has one of the most beautiful buildings in all of history built, which I will cry when I see, right? And the construction began under his reign. And once it was finished, he was so dazzled by it that he looked at it and he was like, oh my God, there is no building in the world that is as beautiful as St. Basil's Cathedral. And he looks over at the architect and he was like, wow, do you think you could ever build another building like that? And the architect was like, I think I'm the only one that could ever build a building like this, right? It's my skill. It's my thing, right? And so to prevent this architect from ever being able to build another cathedral like this one, he had his eyes burned out. All right, so, like, it's a very, very extreme character, right? But nothing trumps this story, right? So Ivan apparently is a very intense figure, and what's going to occur one night at dinner is going to have a very, very long-lasting impact. So what's going to end up happening, apparently, is Ivan's son, Ivan V, arrives at dinner with his wife, right? So what would be Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible's daughter-in-law, right? And so what occurs during this entire thing, we've got the Oprichina running around, the Oprichniki is actually taking people over and, like, killing boyar families, the secret police, which the secret police becomes a very, very, very common thing throughout Russian history. So just keep that in mind. Secret police, Russians, they got them, all right? So, like, now, big thing about it, though, is Ivan shows up to have dinner with his father and his brother, right? So, and he brings his wife with him. And so it's Ivan V, his daughter-in-law, so Ivan V's wife, and then Fedor, all the way at the end of the table. Just coloring and eating chicken nuggets, right? Just like, hey. All right, so, like, Fedor's just over there like, I love these guys, right? Mac and cheese, hit me. All right, so, like, now look. But the big thing about it is Ivan shows up, and Ivan V brings his wife with him. And his wife, what Ivan IV didn't know, was pregnant. All right, so they hadn't released this information yet because, as you know, it is very, very sometimes unlikely for a child to be born in this day and age, right? In the late 1560s, right? So in the late 1500s. And so she was pregnant, and so she was showing signs of pregnancy, right? She was gaining some weight. Her chest was growing, all right? Like, she was having some just bodily changes, right? But when she arrived at dinner, she was wearing an old dress. And so apparently she was just like what, according to Ivan the Terrible, was dressed immodestly. And it offended him so much that Ivan the Terrible got up during dinner and beat his son's wife. Beat her and apparently caused a miscarriage. Right? And some of you are like, oh my God. Yeah, I know, right? It's crazy. And then Ivan V, who was the man that would have been a great ruler for Russia, who was just and smart and probably would have been a better ruler than his father ever was, goes into the throne room and starts yelling at his dad. He's like, how dare you? She was pregnant. What are you doing, you psycho? And there's a thing that Ivan always carried with him. And it was his royal scepter, as you can see it on the ground right here. And Ivan, while his son is yelling at him, believes, he's like, did you just question your allegiance to me? Are you saying that you might betray me? He looks down at his scepter, which, as you can tell, has a pointed end on it. He then reaches up and he stabs his son in the temple with this scepter and kills him. And then apparently after this, he collapsed to the floor, grabbed his son, and began to cry. Now, so we believe that this is yet another example of a possibility that Ivan had bipolar disorder, right? So, like, now, really quickly, though, really insane stuff is that now who's going to be in charge. I'll let you think about that here in a second, okay? But under this, like once that moment occurs, serfs are going to begin to flee this feudal system, right? Things are getting crazy. Ivan is having boyar families killed, right? And he has this other weird issue he has to deal with out in the frontiers of Russia. So as we know, Western Russia is very, very, like, it's more civilized, right? It's got Moscow, it's got major cities, it's got a very, it's much more connected to what you would call being European. So, but out towards the east of Russia, there are these people called Cossacks, right? Cossacks are kind of like land pirates, right? They're the leftovers of Mongolian traders, as whereas, not traitors, like as in like backstabbers, but traders, as in people who trade things. Leftover of like Mongolian traders, and also of these like outskirts Russians, right? And so these Cossacks, they ride horses, they have communities, they have villages, but imagine them kind of like land pirates is the way that I like to think of them, right? And so these serfs are fleeing to these Cossack communities and they're joining up with them, but Ivan is like, these serfs are fleeing and it's affecting the economy. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make it so any serf is now also one of my serfs, and so if you flee, it will result in death, right? And he's going to end up also fighting several large wars with Polish-Lithuania, the next door neighbor, which when we get this bad boy hung up, this map hung up, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's very, very large, right? So, big thing about it though, when he died, the infrastructure collapsed because who is now in charge? Fedor the First would become the new king of Russia, the new Tsar of Russia. And it is believed that Fedor, again, had mental incapabilities, right? He was also apparently sterile and never had any children, right? So this is when Russia would enter this period known as the Time of Troubles, right? And in the Time of Troubles, power struggles and chaos will ensue. And ironically enough, notice a second ago I said that Ivan fought several large wars with Polish-Lithuania. Poland has never been a big battleground state of Europe, but ironically enough, under Fedor's leadership, the Time of Troubles occurs and the Polish take over Russia. What the heck, right? So like Poland takes over Moscow for like a period of time. And then eventually Fedor would die, right? Fedor died without any children, and what's going to end up happening is that a man by the name of Romanov is going to be elected to the new Tsar, right? Michael Romanov, or Mikhail Romanov is what he's actually called in Russian. And Mikhail Romanov is going to be elected as the new Tsar, and this is Ivan's grandnephew, right? And so this is going to occur in 1613. Now, to give you some kind of understanding, Ivan dies in 1584. Fedor rules for several years. He dies. It takes time to elect a new Tsar, so we're now entering into the 1600s, right? So in 1613, the Romanov family takes over, and the Romanovs would rule over Russia for over 300 years, right? So the Romanovs are actually going to rule from 1613 to 1917, right? So the Romanov family is going to grow and expand, and the empire is going to go past the Ukraine and all the way to the Black Sea, right? So like they're going to actually grow this bad boy to the biggest it's ever seen. And all of that has to do with this guy. And his name is Peter the Great, right? So Peter the Great is going to literally become the biggest premier absolutist and modernizer that the Romanov family could have ever asked for, and he is kind of your Russian version of Louis XIV, right? So now, some of you are like, I thought you said Ivan was, and like, well, Ivan's got characteristics of Louis XIV, how Louis was a jerk, but Peter the Great has characteristics of a true absolutist of Russia, right? Now, are they still Eastern, though? You could argue that they are, looking at St. Basil's Cathedral, looking at several other things, but not after Peter the Great. Peter the Great's going to change everything, right? Peter the Great is going to rule from 1682 to 1725, and he's going to create the Western version of Russia that you know now. He's going to create this version of Russia that you believe to be like a Western European state, right? Okay? And so with this, 1 year out of his reign was peaceful. Okay, so like 1 year out of this gigantic time period was peaceful. Much like Louis XIV, Peter the Great fought a very large series of wars. One was against Sweden. One was against Polish-Lithuania. One was against the Ottomans, right? The Ottomans is a big one. Jot this down. Because he fought against the Ottomans in 1689, he's actually going to take over this place called Azov, A-Z-O-V, which is going to be a port city on the Black Sea, right? So he's going to create port cities for Rome, or for Russia, right? But a lot of this is a byproduct of this thing called his Grand Tour, or the Grand Embassy of Peter the Great. And on the Grand Embassy of Peter the Great, he's going to take 200 Russian nobles on an 18-month tour of Western Europe, right? He's going to just sit there and trot them around Western Europe, where they're going to study crafts, weaponry, naval fleets, diplomacy, and he went to the Netherlands to learn how to build ships. He went to England to actually learn how to use those ships in naval warfare. He went to France to learn how to do diplomacy, right? So he actually was in France while Louis was ruling. Well, actually, he never made it to France. He wanted to go to France because France was considered the diplomatic rule of the law of the land. So you have to understand, if you spoke diplomatic matters in Europe, 9 times out of 10 you were speaking French because they were the most populated country in Europe, and it was believed to be the land of diplomacy. But in this moment, on his grand tour, he learns how to build ships, learns how to use modern military since Gustavus Adolphus invaded in the 30 Years' War. He learns how to make actual Western crafts using steel and other new types of other new types of metals. He learns new weaponry. He uses his naval fleet. And just looking at the guy, you can tell that he's very Western, right? He looks like a Western diplomat, right? And so, also, fun fact, he was 6'7". He was a humongous dude. And apparently he dressed in disguise all the time whenever he would trot around Europe. But everybody was like, oh, there's that giant Russian guy. Pretty confident that's Peter. So he wasn't that good at the disguise game, right? So he was 6'7". He was huge. And he was blown away by the power brought by trade by the Dutch and the English East India Companies. Now, this is very important that we understand, okay? Blown away by it. Blown away by how much power can be brought through trade, right? So that's going to lead into something we're going to talk about tomorrow, and we're going to get into Peter the Great a little bit, and we're also going to start England tomorrow, okay? So I'll talk to you guys soon. Y'all have a good one.